Bar Melville is giving away a food hamper valued at 500 Rand. To win, all you have to do is subscribe to our YouTube channel, I Love Melville Live, and engage on our weekly shows, Melville Streets in the morning from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. and Melville Drive in the afternoon from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. right here on ilovemelville.live.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Week in Review, and coming to you from Melville in Johannesburg. And my panel today, Dr. Iva Serakinski is from WITS. Jan Joubert is an independent political reporter and journalist. And Hugo Pinaar is from the Bureau for Economic Research in Stellenbosch. He's an economist there. And we're starting with matters economic straight out. And that is, on Friday, the bad news that two of the ratings agencies, Moody's and Fitch, have both downgraded the country even further. Its sovereign debt rating went further into junk. And we also heard that, that they're worried about possible fiscal weakness. They're worried about the high debt levels. And of course, as I said, not good news at all. And Hugo Pinaar, I'm going to put you in the spot here. Your making of this, and how much of a bad news story is this?
No, I think it certainly is. Kobus, good afternoon to you and the panelists. I think if you read through all three rating agencies, the statements that they put out, I mean, my main take is that whereas if you go back a couple of years ago, the agencies probably gave South Africa the benefit of the doubt on things like structural growth reforms, fiscal consolidation, etc. But we are now long past that point. I think now the agencies are saying that, look, as a country, as a government, you now really have to show your hand, and we're sort of gonna punish you, if you want to put it that way, until you properly show your hand on getting the debt situation under control, putting in place, as opposed to just talking about it, but actually putting in place growth-enhancing reforms as well.
What do you expect to see as a result of that? What do you think government needs to do now to stop this decline in the ratings and to actually turn it around, hopefully?
Look, I think it is implement, right? I mean, we keep on having the same discussions, and we sort of in a perennial planning cycle, it seems. I think if you ask most people in this country, we sort of have a good idea what the problems are, and we have some idea of what we need to do. So that's not the issue. I mean, I think the issue is simply those plans that are in place. If we can just implement those at speed, that may make quite a difference in terms of the whole sentiment and the narrative surrounding South Africa.
But looking at the situation, the deeper we go down in these ratings, the less what I call good investments we will likely get from other countries because of their mandates they have and so on. So we saw a story this morning in one of the papers that we're seeing a lot of money coming into the country, but that's going into paper. It's going into the capital market instruments and so on. We're not seeing any sign of a recovery in fixed investments and that sort of thing, the nice stuff that we would need to actually get the economy going again. So it's becoming a bit of a vicious circle, really.
So this is the thing, Kobus. I mean, the further one slides down these rating scales, the more speculative the capital flows that you receive are. Now, what that means is that at certain times when you have a global risk on sentiment, so for example, good news on COVID-19 vaccines, suddenly investors are more optimistic. So during those times, then South Africa tends to benefit and still does. But the problem is, as soon as that sentiment turns around, that capital is just as quickly to flow out of a more risky country like South Africa, as opposed to what you're saying, the more longer term foreign direct investment. So an investor putting up a factory in South Africa, or sinking a new mine shaft or something like that. I mean, those are the more sustainable type of flows that we really require.
So Jan, what we actually see is that what we need is really policy changes, policy implementation, because policies have been coming out, abounding over the years, but we never seem to implement these things. And now we're sitting with a situation that where there's been such pressure put on government regarding its debts and its inability to spend on anything, that and I get the idea that there's a lack of real political will to actually do anything, or maybe it's just an inability or a lack of knowledge on how you do it.
Cobus, good afternoon to you and to the panelists. I think what we need is policy certainty. At this stage, the Treasury and the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Mboweni, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, etc., they know what they want to do. And they give dire warning upon dire warning that if their call is not heeded for fiscal discipline, for very necessary cuts to be made, especially for NGOs, then in the end, we are going to face a fiscal cliff. But what we are seeing is that the ANC is speaking with forked tongue. An example this week was with the SABC, which we'll come to later, but where certain decisions were taken to cut costs, and within a day or two, out went Pule Mabe, the spokesperson of the ANC, on a big truck, and did the populist thing. We're not going to cut this, we're not going to cut that. So in the end, if we are going to spend 10 billion on SAA, but we don't have 2 billion for the COVAX money, which we need for, in the end, to become part of the worldwide vaccine drive, then quite frankly, one can see why the credit agencies do not give us the benefit of the doubt. What I would like to know in the end, I mean, what Hugo said is true about direct investment, although, of course, we are lucky in that there is some mining investment, and this Brulpadda basin south of Mossel Bay seems to have some sort of oil and gas finding. But what I'm wondering is, where is the country going to actually improve its fiscal position if things continue as it does, where we will get investment, I guess, through our natural bounty, but in the end, we might be in a situation where the government is borrowing too much and we might be heading for that fiscal cliff.
Hugo, can you hear me? We seem to have a sound problem there. Iver Sarakinsky, can you hear me? Hello, Hugo.
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. Did you hear what you heard? What Jan had to say now? But actually, I just want to hop over to Iver for a moment, because Iver, what Hugo said now, or rather Jan said about fiscal policy certainty, and Tito Mboweni and all these guys making the right noises. But we've also heard on this program, we've heard that the Minister of Finance is hiding out on his farm most of the time, hardly ever puts his head out, doesn't attend things at Parliament or wherever. And we see him tweet now and then just about, but for the rest of it, it seems that he's really isolated himself because he's not getting enough support from the president and his party.
Well, there's a lot of speculation about that, whether he is out on a limb without support, or whether he's aloof and wants to stay out of the fray and to try and dictate the things that need to be done without being caught up in fisticuffs all the time with people. So it's not quite clear exactly what is going on there. But what it does suggest is that the president, the Reserve Bank governor, and the Minister of Finance are in a minority in the club that are trying to gear South Africa to respond to the various crises that we have, and that you've got the majority of players who have a very different vision on how to get out of this. And the more sophisticated thinkers in that camp have some notion of spending your way out of a crisis based on new monetary thinking, whereas the populists just want to throw money at a problem. And in that camp, you've probably got people who just want to benefit from even increased state spending. So I think it's a complicated mix of all these things, which creates the uncertainty, which creates the lack of clarity as to who's pulling the truck, who's driving the truck even, in terms of where this is all going. And that partly feeds into the downgrades which were announced on Friday.
What we also saw this past week, Michu, is the governor announcing that their repo rate would remain unchanged, which is a bit of a surprise for some people, because quite a few people were forecasting that he had enough space to maneuver to actually give us another rate cut before any type of upswing should come. Were you surprised?
Not really, Cobus. I mean, so the consensus was for an unchanged decision. Yes, there were some people calling for a cut, but we also thought that they would keep it unchanged. And just out of interest, I mean, this ties nicely into the rating agency discussion, because you are right. If one just looks at the growth outlook, and especially if you look at our inflation outlook, there is actually potentially ample space for the Reserve Bank to reduce the repo rate further. But they have also warned, as Jan suggested earlier, on the fiscal risks that we face. And at least on two occasions in the statement that accompanied their decision, they flagged fiscal risks. So I think for the time being, before there's greater clarity on where we're going in terms of our debt levels, that is an important inhibitor to the Reserve Bank to actually provide further interest rate relief. So it's almost like fiscal policy is starting to dominate what the Reserve Bank can do. Or let's put it differently, the Reserve Bank almost sees themselves as the final sort of remaining anchor of macro stability in South Africa, and they do a hell of a good job on that. But so they can't afford to slip given our fiscal situation.
So what do you expect? Do you see rates maybe even moving up early in the new year?
No, I don't think so. I think given that our inflation trajectory is well under control, we just simply think the Reserve Bank will sit back for probably the next 12 months or so and just do nothing for the time being.
Because I think, to put it into perspective, I mean, we're really sitting with rates right now at their lowest for decades. So in that sense, it's, you know, when we look at people planning businesses or wanting to plan businesses, this is one good thing that's waiting for people if they want to, you know, make use of it.
Yeah, so I mean, the repo rate has declined by 300 basis points, or 3 percentage points so far this year. So that is a very aggressive reduction in the policy rate, and you're already starting to see the impact of that in the property market, for example. So despite the I almost want to say the COVID chaos, the property market in some areas at least is actually quite buoyant. And one of the reasons for that is simply because the cost of financing those properties have come down so much. So yes, I think it's not sufficient to mitigate against the dramatic income loss due to COVID, business closures, retrenchments, etc. But it is certainly helping Cobus, no doubt.
Well, we'll see how it goes from here and keep our fingers crossed.
Cobus,
Yo.
Cobus, can I put in a question perhaps for the Bureau of Economic Research? I don't know whether they've done research on this, but what do they think the chances are? And I don't want to put Igo on the spot, maybe you haven't done it yet, but what do you think the chances are of us avoiding a fiscal cliff?
So, Janjan, I mean, there are various scenarios of what a fiscal crisis would entail, right? So the worst case, I guess, would be an outright default, i.e., the government is not able to repay either the principal or the interest on our debt. So that would be a very dire Argentina type of scenario. But there are other different ways of a fiscal crisis. The other one you can think of, and this I think is one that is perhaps more probable, is that in order to prevent a default, let's say over the next 5 years or so, we actually have to go to the IMF or such lenders for a proper bailout that has conditionalities attached to them. Now, so in other words, that is a type of a fiscal cliff scenario. My concern is, given the ideological reluctance from the ANC to approach institutions like the IMF, that we actually may wait until it's too late. So we may end up defaulting, and then of course you have to go to the IMF in any event. But we can actually prevent that by a preemptive move to the IMF. So I think, Janjan, on a 5-year view, we are very likely to face, unless there's a dramatic correction, some sort of a fiscal crisis. It's just a bit unsure on exactly what form that will take.
But when we do borrow or get help from the IMF, these loans are normally always accompanied actually by certain what they like to call conditionalities. The question that comes up for me is, does South Africa in the first place have the ability to still adhere to those conditionalities? Do they actually have the people in the managerial and governing structures who can ensure that we do adhere to those conditionalities? What do you think?
Look, Cobus, you don't have a choice in that situation, right? I mean, so these guys are clever, right? They give you the money in tranches, and they monitor whether you stick to, let's call it, the program or the conditionalities. And if you don't get the money, right? So it's sort of, you don't have a choice. So, but of course, your sovereignty is taken away, and that's exactly part of the ANC's reluctance, and I can understand that. But so we know what needs to be done. I mean, so we have to do this by ourselves, and starting with expenditure consolidation, reducing the public sector wage bill, etc. Now, let me just quickly say that the Treasury, their strategy is spot on, right? So this is exactly what they are aiming for, reducing the wage bill. They're not talking about aggressive tax hikes, so they want to consolidate on the expenditure side. There's a lot of literature that suggests that's exactly the way that you should be doing it. But again, the question is whether the Treasury, the Minister of Finance, will be given the backing from Cabinet to actually follow through on this, because it will be painful, these amounts of expenditure cuts. But much better that we do it on our own terms, as opposed to being forced to do it from some outside lender.
Well, let's go to our next topic, because it actually, in a certain way, it almost fits into the slot for me. and that is the unhappiness and uncertainty at the SABC. This past week, we saw people actually protesting against letters that a lot of staff members received, saying that they would possibly be retrenched or they'd have to apply for jobs at a lower scale and that sort of thing. And then suddenly we had the Minister of Communications, and we had other members of government and the ANC outside the party itself saying, no, we don't agree with this. And so now the whole thing's been put on the back burner again while they sort out what they want to do. The thing that really, there are two things I believe that would worry anybody who knows what, has some insight on what's going on at the SABC. One is that this decision was taken by people who don't really understand what public broadcasting is about. And at the same time, you see government interference in a management decision that really shouldn't be there. And I think for political reasons, not for good governance reasons. What was your impression, Iva?
Of complicated things going on. What struck me as being the most disturbing was the breaches in corporate governance at the SABC at a number of levels. And this was very, very worrying, in that you had the minister saying stuff, you had the deputy minister intervening, and the SABC is different to other state-owned enterprises in that it reports to Parliament, with the minister having very, very hands-off approach in terms of the legislation, unlike other SOEs. So for the political heads to say that is quite problematic. And then, of course, going to Luthuli House and getting the Secretary General of the ANC live to make statements about direct political interference in the SABC was very, very worrying. And the issue here, and this is reflected in the rating agency's concerns, is that as a board member, you've got fiduciary responsibilities. And those responsibilities means you've got to make the books balance, and you've got to oversee the enterprise to make sure that it complies with legislation and financial sustainability. And all of that political interference is to undermine every single attempt that's been done over an 18-month period to exactly try and achieve the sustainability. So people are watching that and they see this interference, and then they say, what about SAA? What about Eskom? What about Transnet? What about PRASA? And there you've got a picture of serious, serious financial trouble just at a corporate governance breakdown level. And for me, that's the big one. There are a whole range of other subsidiary issues there.
Jan, I want you to shoot me down if I'm wrong, but when you look at the situation at SABC and try and figure out where all this came from, the one thing that strikes me is that you have the communication portfolio committee, the people who actually appoint the board or help to appoint the board of the SABC. On that committee, with the exception of one or two people, Diane Kohler-Barnard and one or two maybe, there's not a single person there with any background in broadcasting or any knowledge of what goes on there. Then they appoint a board, which if you go look at that board, you will battle to find anybody there who's really somebody in broadcasting or would have any knowledge about what should be happening there. They then are responsible for appointing the top management of the SABC. And now you're confronted with a situation, if you go and look at the top 40 management members of the SABC, from the chief executive officer downwards, there's only one person so far that I could recognize or identify there who actually has any idea of what goes on in broadcasting management, and that's the head of radio at the moment. She's been there for a couple of decades in various positions. So how do you get people like that? There's a whole system there of people not being there for what they should be there for?
Quibus, I think that the SABC is actually not a special case. It is, to some degree, pretty much in the same situation as all the SOEs. And the problem we have and have had for a long time, cadre deployment rather than the ability to actually do the job. If you do not appoint the best person for the job, you're not going to get the best result. So what we have seen over the years, we've seen very many SABC board members being appointed and resigning and this and that. But the problem is, and this has always been pointed out by the two strong opposition parties on that committee, which you rate so lowly, namely the DA and the EFF, that the ANC always comes with a list that was preordained by Luthuli House, and which finds a job for another ANC cadre who might have struck it unlucky somewhere in his life. I'll just give an example just to show that this is not changing. We saw about 2 weeks ago the appointment of the PRASA board. And when I saw who the chair of the PRASA board was, it's someone I know very well, Mr. Leonard Ramatlakane. Mr. Ramatlakane is a very good man. He has been in the Western Cape legislature forever. His political career has taken a downturn. Now suddenly he is parachuted into PRASA, and to the best of my ability, Mr. Ramatlakane and I know just about the same amount about trains. So the issue with the SABC is the same thing. In the end, with all the SOEs, the books must balance. And if it is so that the SABC is headed for a 1.2 billion rand loss this year, then they must balance their books. Exactly how they must do it, Quibus, you're the broadcaster, you have all those decades of experience. I guess I'm going to make the same mistake that the portfolio committee makes, in that my interest is in politics. But I don't know exactly what needs to be done. But what cannot be done is the populist line that is being pushed by Pule Mabi and the likes in the ANC. Unfortunately, with all the SOEs, including the SABC, it needs to be that we cut our cloth according to what we can afford, and that goes for the SABC as well. I'm very sorry, because I listen to RSG, the Afrikaans broadcaster, basically all the time. It's the only radio station I listen to, and I hear that so many of them have gotten letters which basically fire them, and that makes me very sad. You know how radio is, it's the most personal of mediums, but unfortunately it's time for the tough choices to be made.
The interesting thing, and that's my problem with this type of retrenchment. It's a very blunt instrument, it seems, because there's been an overall decision: let's get rid of all the presenters and get them all on freelance contracts if they're willing to go on to it. Which means that these people lose benefits, lose pension, lose medical aid, and that sort of thing. It would have, to my mind, have been better if you mentioned RSG. Here's a station that's more than trebled its listeners, its audience over the past 20 years. It's run as a tight ship. RSG used to have something like 140 personnel. They're now down to 16. And now they have to retrench 14 of them. You know, to me, surely you should be aiming at those areas where people aren't doing the job, where people aren't up to scratch, can't do what's required of them, because the public broadcaster is a very specific animal. If you go and look at any country who's had a good public broadcasting experience, like the BBC, NPR in America, and ABC in Australia. So that's what concerns me is that when you start cutting to get your ship on even keel again, it doesn't help cutting that area, cutting away the screws of the ship. You need to be more specific, and this is not happening. This is a very blunt approach to the whole thing, Ivor.
When you're facing a crisis, you've got to deal with the crisis bluntly in order to steady the ship, in order to expand later. And that's the difficulty of this. So a lot of these issues are being reopened for discussion. And let's wait to see what creative solutions those who facing retrenchment come up with. I haven't seen the unions or the people in the public eye putting forward the view that everyone take a 25% or 30% chop in salary. So that would be another way of making it sustainable. And if one looks at the numbers, those salaries have been grossly inflated over time, just in terms of malfeasance and very poor management. So where do you begin to fix such a serious problem? If you start to be too nuanced and too sensitive, then you don't deal with the problem. You enable certain things to continue at the expense of others. So it's an invidious position for the board and for the senior management to be in. I wouldn't want that job for anything in the world, because whatever you do is going to be wrong in terms of some negative outcomes. And in the situation that the SABC and other SOEs are in, it's reached the point now where you've just got to steer the ship, steady the ship using drastic actions, and then rethink in 5 years' time how you can rebuild capacity and how you can reconsider reservicing your client base. But it's just not business as usual now. There's just no way that it continue in the way that it's been functioning. No more bailouts. There's no money for bailouts. The cash is going to run out next year sometime, and then what? So, wisdom of Solomon.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed that they can actually sort something out there, and without too much bloodletting. Let's go to somebody else who's been in the news this week, and that's former President Jacob Zuma, who walked out of the Zondo Commission hearing this week after the Deputy Chief Justice, Mr. Zondo, refused to recuse himself and gave very good reasons for not to. How does the president handle this situation? Or do we still wait for Mr. Zondo, Judge Zondo, can he come up with with an arrest warrant for the president or the former president? What's going to happen here, Ivor?
Well, the state president dare not get involved in this, because if he gets involved, then all the suspicions of him being the driving force of the commission in order to settle political scores will be a rampant fire, and that will undermine his ability to even do the small things that he's trying to do at the moment. So this matter has to be dealt with from within the commission itself. And Judge Zondo is going to have to find a way to sanction former President Zuma for his contempt of the commission in terms of walking out without permission. And it's not like contempt of court, where you can do something with security in terms of a legal process. The Commissions Act is more ambiguous and softer. And that means that he's going to have to go through the case law. He's going to have to read the Act 10 times before he can announce some form of sanction. But some form of sanction has to come, because this has the potential to undermine the rule of law throughout the country. You pitch up at magistrate's court on a traffic offence, and you just say, "Excuse me, magistrate, I'm going to excuse myself now." And you quote the precedent of the former president doing exactly the same. So there's no way that it can be left alone, but what action is taking is going to require very careful legal research and very, very nuanced announcement when the commission convenes again tomorrow.
Jan Jan? Jan Jan?
Yes, well, we saw a rather pathetic show by the former president this week. Point is, you can't just leave a commission because you don't feel like attending anymore, and because you refuse to basically stand by what you did, or to be questioned, or to explain yourself. I think the situation is not as tough as people might think. Um, I agree with Ivor on the two main things. The first is there's no way that the president or any politician can get involved in this. This is a legal process, and we will be heading for kangaroo court country if we have politicians deciding legal issues. Secondly, that if no action and no clear action and no effective action, strict action is taken against Mr. Zuma, the whole concept of the rule of law is in dire straits in this country. Indeed, any husband who hits his wife and has to go to court can just excuse himself. The same goes for all the gangsters in the Western Cape, etc., etc. So what needs to be done is that Mr. Justice Zondo would have to look at the Commission's Act. It's not such a tough act. Basically, it says that you can be fined some amount of pounds, which I think will not work. But also, and in addition to that, you can be sentenced to 6 months in prison, and then that needs to be done, and that is then up not to the Commission, not to the government, but to the National Prosecuting Authority, to Shamila Batoy, to do their job. And I think people must perhaps just let the law take its course, rather than make politics out of a situation which is a legal one.
But staying with us now, and what has to happen, as you said, the president either cannot afford to get involved here. But at the same time, it's as though his hands are so tied, while his Secretary General of the ANC, Mr. Magashule, we read in the Weekly Mail or daily, the Mail Guardian on Friday, is actively going to his stronghold, I want to call it, the branches of the ANC, and whipping up support for himself there against the president. And there's even speculation that this could actually finally be a final blow for the president if he doesn't know how to handle this.
And that's the most serious thing that comes out of that whole saga, is exactly the revelation by the SG, Ace Magashule, that he is mobilizing the branches. And he wouldn't say something to that effect if he hadn't canvassed the support of the branches. So he's quite confident that the branches are going to back him. And he's got probably good reason to do that, because the cleanup at national and provincial level, when it gets to provincial level, is going to hit the branches as hard as it's hit many national figures. So he's got natural allies there at local level in terms of municipal malfeasance and corruption aligned to the branches in various ways. So that's his power base, and it's more serious than that, because it's the branches who send delegates to vote for ANC leadership in 2022, which isn't long off. It's not far away. And that tells you that the fight for the heart, soul, mind of the ANC is on. It's underway. All in that simple statement. There's a lot that is revealed by it. And the President Ramaphosa, needs to be watching that one very closely, because if he can't get sufficient support in the branches, and the test will be the National General Council on Policy next year, we watch that one very closely to see what the trend is. If the trend is against him, that means there's new ANC leadership 2022, and that's a whole new ball game in terms of the contests and the personalities who come into office and come into power, assuming the ANC wins the election with a clear majority in 2024. So some real uncertainties and some real challenges that are revealed by Ace Magashule in that very confident statement that he made. I don't think he wanted to reveal as much as he did, but he did so nonetheless.
And that brings us to an end of today's broadcast, unfortunately. So Brackenfell will have to stand over. We really hope to have a bit of a discussion on that too, but that will have to wait for next weekend. In the meantime, I'd like to thank my panel. That was Dr. Iver Serakinski of WITS, Nico Pinaar of the BER in Stellenbosch, and Jan Huber in Cape Town, the independent political journalist. And I'd like to thank you all for watching this afternoon. See you next weekend. My name's Cobus Bester, and have a nice week.
Guess what, livers? Spar Melville is giving away a food hamper valued at 500 Rand. To win, all you have to do is subscribe to our YouTube channel, I Love Melville Live, and engage on our weekly shows, Melville Streets in the morning from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. and Melville Drive in the afternoon from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. right here on ilovemelville.live.